Welcome back to Crossroads, a weekly community affairs program.
Thank you guys so much for joining us. I am honored this morning to have a man with me who has seen more than I could ever imagine. He was a photographer for Nelson Mandela. George Hallett is here with me this morning. Thank you for being here.
My pleasure.
Now, I got the news release and I thought this must be a dream. This man photographed Nelson Mandela. How did you get to do that?
Well, I lived in England and in Europe in general in exile. As a black South African, I decided in 1970 I had enough of this nonsense. Every day you're reminded that you're inferior or told that you're inferior. Where to sit, where to sleep, where to do anything, and where they even bury you, determined by the color of your skin. And I became aware of a musical called Hair, the Age of Aquarius, and all that stuff. Hippies. Television was still banned in South Africa because it was the devil's work.
Of course.
And I decided to go to London. And I got a job with the Times. And of course they used me to photograph the black communities because somehow I could fit into that situation. The Asian community or the Afro-Caribbean community or the African community. And so I worked for the Times Educational Supplement. I did a bit of work for the BBC television and for different magazines. And I also worked for Heinemann's African Writer series. So I did book covers for the African Writer series, made them exciting photographic covers. And of course I read every book, met the authors, I photographed them. And last year I published a book called Portraits of African Writers, 40 years of work.
Wow.
Which I'm very proud about. But to come back to the thing, a lot of exiles lived in London. And one of them, who's now our Minister of Arts and Culture, Paulo Jordan, who studied in the States incidentally, is now Dr. Paulo Jordan. We were very good friends, and he used to model for me in London. And I photographed the exile musicians, the African musicians, and all our cultural activities. And then one day I'm sitting in Paris in my apartment, and he calls me and says, listen, I want you to come home soon and photograph the 94 elections, the first democratic elections.
Exactly.
And I want you to be our official photographer, which meant I had access behind the scenes to Nelson Mandela. I had carte blanche all over the country. It was absolutely astonishing. And I remember saying to him, well, how much are you guys going to pay? He said, don't talk money, we're a liberation movement. I said, listen, I live in Europe, it's expensive.
Exactly.
He said, you're coming home, baby.
Okay.
And I went back, and they gave me air tickets to travel within the country. And the first time I met Nelson Mandela was at a strange thing. It was a television setup like this, and we had a crew from America to come and teach Nelson Mandela how to perform to the camera, because having lived on the island for 27 years without female company, no children, nothing normal, he had a very hangdog look about him. He looked sad. And our American advisor says, you cannot get people to vote for you if you look miserable.
Right.
And I thought, my God, they're telling Mandela shit. And he says, tell me how to do it. So they went through the whole thing, and I photographed that experience. And then we had a lunch break, and I followed him outside. And ex-President de Klerk called him, and the conversation was, there's all this violence in the country. And Mandela knew it was a third force set up by the previous regime. So he was telling de Klerk, and I started photographing him, and he's standing very cool. And he gave the phone back to the lady, and then suddenly these women appeared. There's a picture which I love very much. I call it the first encounter. These women suddenly recognized him, and for the first time they were face to face with Nelson Mandela. And they just went, wow.
And I think we got some of those pictures of
parents
that can show those.
That shot.
The women are just running toward him and they're
ululating.
Yes.
And I'm there, and it's one frame. It just happened for a split second.
Wow.
Unfortunately, I was pre-focused, so when it happened, I just went,
and captured that moment.
Yes, and that series of pictures that I took of Mandela on the election trail won the World Press Photo Award in Amsterdam in '95.
What kind of man is he? So many people, we see him here in America, we see him on television doing interviews, we read articles, you know, especially people in the African and African American community here in the States, but we never have access to him. You do. What kind of man is he?
You know, when I was alone with him one day in a room, I walked into this room and there he was. And there was coffee and water and milk and stuff on the table. And my heart went, what do I speak to him about? So I said, Mr. President, can I pour you a cup of coffee? George, you know, coffee is not good for a man my age. However, a glass of water. He's very dignified, speaks in measured tones. And I said, I'm doing the photography. Yes, I'm aware of all that. Yes, I've been informed. Hope you're enjoying this and all that. And my wife, my ex-wife, is Cameroonian. She was sitting outside. Little did I know that seconds before that he'd walked past her and greeted her. And she just went,
She was starstruck.
Starstruck, yes. And then a British MP, Mr. Hayne, who used to be very active in England against white sport from South Africa. He tried to isolate South African sport. And we had Dennis Brutus, a poet in the States, doing the same thing. And then they started chatting, and I photographed the two of them, and then I could breathe again. But over the subsequently, I met him in his official residence in Cape Town. And I chatted to him, and I said, Mr. President, you're very happy today? And he says, yes, my divorce papers have just come through. So he's got a great sense of humor also. And absolutely amazing patience. And I followed him around all over the country. He goes to schools, the way he talks to school children, the way he talks to workers or industrial leaders or religious leaders. He is an absolutely big-hearted man with great wisdom.
Wow. Now, you are here at St. Cloud State University, and you've been talking to students and faculty there. What's the biggest misconception that people have about Africa?
Well, let me take South Africa firstly, because Africa's part of Africa, it's in a mess. Zimbabwe, it's disgraceful. That an old 85-year-old man refuses to step down and let the younger people run the country. He criminalizes his own people, treats them with disrespect. There's no opposition newspapers, it's only his voice. You know? There was a headline on our Sunday Times last Sunday when I left South Africa, big headlines, the vampire must go. And there's pictures of his eyes across the front page. But look, we are 14 years into our democracy.